The house on Willow Creek Lane looked serene from the outside, its porch light glowing faintly against the dimming sky. To neighbors passing by, nothing appeared unusual. Stacy Feldman, known for her warmth and tireless devotion to community events, had spent her afternoon preparing for another busy week ahead. To the world, she was the image of stability. A mother, a wife, a friend who seemed to always have more to give. Yet behind those drawn curtains, tension simmered. An unease she carried quietly, like a shadow clinging to her every move. Inside, the home hummed with stillness. Stacy moved methodically through the kitchen, stacking dishes, wiping counters, her mind elsewhere. She paused by the family photos lining the hallway. Smiling faces, perfect frames, a life that looked polished but increasingly felt staged. Her eyes lingered on one photo, her children laughing, arms around her. For them, she had endured more than anyone knew. Her husband sat in the living room, the television casting a pale glow across his face. He barely glanced up when Stacy entered, his expression unreadable. Words between them were few, but weighted. Their marriage had grown brittle, like glass strained under pressure, one more sharp word away from shattering. As the evening deepened, the silence inside the house grew suffocating. Stacy retreated upstairs, her phone in hand, sending a final series of quiet messages. Friends would later remember the strange tone in her texts. Short, distracted, tinged with fatigue. At least one message hinted at confrontation. By 9:30 p.m., the house fell eerily still. Neighbors, later questioned, recalled hearing nothing unusual. No shouting, no crashing, just the ordinary quiet of suburbia. But inside, something irreversible was unfolding. At 10:11 p.m., a call pierced through the calm of the local emergency dispatch center. A man's frantic voice filled the line. "My wife, she's not breathing. Please send someone, hurry!" His words were quick, panicked, almost desperate. It was Stacy's husband. First responders arrived minutes later. The scene they entered was confusing. Stacy on the floor, her husband hovering, hands trembling. He insisted he had found her unresponsive after a shower, claimed he tried to revive her, begged them to do something. But despite their efforts, the night ended in tragedy. Stacy Feldman was declared dead before midnight. What struck some of the responders, however, was not only the suddenness of her death, but the unsettling details. Bruises that didn't quite align with his story, a room that felt oddly staged, and a husband whose grief seemed more performative than piercing. Still, protocol dictated restraint. Reports were written, statements gathered, and for the moment, her death would be explained away. The neighborhood awoke the next morning to hushed conversations. A beloved wife, gone so suddenly, it was unthinkable. Yet, even as casseroles were delivered and condolences exchanged, whispers of doubt lingered. How could someone so vibrant be gone without warning? The answers, for now, were hidden. But behind the neat lawns and polite sympathy, suspicion was quietly growing. This was not merely the end of Stacy Feldman's life. It was the beginning of a story that would unravel everything her husband claimed to be. And as the curtain closed on that final evening, the stage was set, for a marriage dissected, for secrets exposed, and for a truth darker than anyone was prepared to believe. The morning after Stacy Feldman's death, headlines and hushed whispers painted the same picture, a sudden tragedy in a seemingly perfect household. To the outside world, Stacy and her husband were the model couple. Their names appeared in community newsletters, their photographs displayed in charity brochures, their smiles immortalized in framed portraits across the walls of their suburban home. At every fundraiser dinner, they were a matched pair, he in his pressed suit, Stacy in a gown that never failed to impress. Their neighbors remembered them hosting backyard barbecues, wine glasses clinking under strings of golden lights, laughter drifting into the summer air. In public, they embodied composure. To friends and acquaintances, they were the couple others admired, envied even. But perfection, as it often is, was carefully constructed. Behind closed doors, Stacy's smile was thinner, her laugh more forced. She had mastered the art of keeping up appearances, of nodding at her husband's stories even when her eyes carried exhaustion. She was the glue of their household, the caretaker, the mother who smoothed over rough edges. Yet, she confided in close friends, small remarks that betrayed her growing unease. "I don't feel like myself anymore," she had once whispered after a charity event, her eyes darting toward the room where her husband stood. "It's like I'm living in someone else's life, not mine." Her husband, meanwhile, thrived on control. He managed details with precision. What time they arrived at gatherings, how long they stayed, which causes deserved their public support. To outsiders, it looked like attentiveness. To Stacy, it became suffocating. He corrected her casually in conversations, dictated their schedules, and rarely tolerated deviation. The illusion of balance cracked further when photographs were revisited. Smiling frames, yes, but look closer, stacks. His eyes sometimes dulled, her posture tightened beside him. Friends began to notice, though no one dared to say it outright then. They assumed fatigue, the wear of motherhood, the stress of life. Few suspected how much control weighed on her shoulders. One night stands out in memory. At a dinner party, amid laughter and clattering dishes, Stacy's hand trembled as she passed a glass of wine. Her husband leaned in close, whispering something that made her smile falter, her body stiffen. To most, it looked like marital banter, but for one friend watching closely, it looked like dominance, carefully masked behind charm. As weeks became months, Stacy's unhappiness grew harder to hide. She began withdrawing, canceling social plans and excusing herself early from events. She still smiled for the camera, still posed with her children, still carried herself with grace. But in the quiet moments, the ones rarely seen, her weariness showed. The public facade remained untouched until her sudden death shattered it. In the days following, reporters and neighbors repeated the same refrain. They looked so happy. They had everything. The words carried weight, but also a dissonance. If everything was so perfect, why had Stacy seemed so restless in her final months? The staged perfection was cracking now, piece by piece, under the weight of questions. And those questions would soon fall into the hands of investigators who began to revisit every photo, every party, every carefully constructed moment of a marriage that might never have been what it seemed. The curtain of illusion had lifted. What lay beneath would take the story in a darker direction, toward medical reports, inconsistencies, and the haunting question of how Stacy Feldman really died. In the days that followed Stacy Feldman's sudden death, the machinery of official procedure moved forward with clinical efficiency. The coroner's office opened a file, the medical examiner conducted an autopsy, and paperwork trickled in with the weight of finality. On the surface, it seemed routine. An unexpected death in a suburban home, tragic, but explainable. The medical examiner's report concluded with a word that carried more power than anyone realized. Accidental. The cause of death was listed as drowning in the shower, the explanation being that Stacy may have slipped, lost consciousness, and inhaled water. There were, however, details that did not quite fit. Bruising patterns along her arms and torso raised quiet questions, but in the absence of obvious evidence of foul play, the case was closed with a stamp. Her husband accepted the report with a strange calmness. While others wept uncontrollably, he spoke in measured tones about freak accidents and God's will. To paramedics who had rushed to the scene, his grief had already seemed unusual, restrained, almost mechanical. Now, with the medical examiner's conclusion in his favor, he seemed eager to move on, to file away his wife's death as a tragedy without lingering on the details. The funeral came swiftly, the church pews filled with friends, neighbors, and members of the community who had once admired the couple's seemingly perfect marriage. Flowers adorned the altar, hymns filled the air, and Stacy's casket was lowered into the earth with solemn ceremony. Her children clutched each other's hands, faces pale with confusion more than understanding. To them, their mother's absence was not yet real. It was only the silence at the breakfast table, the empty seat at bedtime prayers. What haunted those closest to Stacy was not just her absence, but her husband's demeanor. His eulogy struck many as detached, polished rather than raw. He spoke of her charity work, her devotion as a mother, her unexpected passing. But his eyes rarely welled with tears, his voice never broke. One friend whispered afterward, "It felt like he was reading from a script." The days after the funeral were marked by casseroles delivered, sympathy cards stacked on the counter, and neighbors offering quiet support. Yet, beneath the polite condolences, unease grew. Friends recalled Stacy's recent unhappiness, her whispered doubts, her visible weariness at social gatherings. Her parents clung to memories of a daughter who had confided in them about stress and marital strain. None could reconcile the woman they knew with the sterile conclusion of accidental death. Still, without a crime officially declared, their doubts remained whispers in private. The authorities had ruled, the paperwork filed, and the system had closed its doors. To challenge it felt impossible. But seeds of suspicion, once planted, rarely die. Late at night, Stacy's best friend replayed their last conversations, recalling the unease in her tone, the heaviness behind her words. She remembered Stacy confessing, "I don't know how much longer I can do this." The statement, so casual then, now echoed with grim weight. The story of Stacy Feldman's death could have ended here, locked forever under the label of accident. Yet the truth has a way of leaking through cracks, especially when those cracks are widened by grief, persistence, and love. For now, the official record was closed. But behind the scenes, doubt was gathering force, among her friends, her family, and eventually within the investigative world itself. And as the quiet settled over Willow Creek Lane, the stage was set for whispers of betrayal to emerge, unraveling the myth of the perfect marriage once. Doubt has a way of whispering louder than official conclusions. For those who loved Stacy Feldman most, the word accident never felt like closure. It felt like denial. Among them was Claire, her closest confidant, who carried memories too heavy to ignore. Claire remembered late-night conversations, moments when Stacy's cheerful mask slipped away. The words still echoed in her mind. "I think he's seeing someone else." Stacy had spoken it softly, almost ashamed, as though admitting it might make it more real. Their friendship had been a sanctuary, a place where Stacy allowed herself to peel back the image of perfection she showed the world. Over coffee or hushed phone calls, Claire had glimpsed the cracks in her marriage. Stacy confided about her husband's sharp temper, the sudden outbursts over trivial things, the way silence would hang for days as punishment. She told her about feeling constantly monitored, as if her every move required approval. One particular evening came flooding back with painful clarity. They had been seated in Claire's kitchen, the children upstairs, laughter drifting faintly down the stairs. Stacy's eyes darted toward the door before she spoke, voice trembling. "He scares me sometimes," she admitted. Not always, not with the kids, but with me. It's different. If I say the wrong thing, it's like I've set off a fire I can't put out. Claire had urged her to seek help, to at least consider leaving. But Stacy only shook her head, her expression caught between fear and resignation. I've thought about it, she whispered, about getting out, but he'd never let me go. Those words, never let me go, would become haunting prophecy. Flashbacks painted a clearer picture of the control she endured. At parties, Stacy flinched when her husband's voice grew sharp. At charity events, she stood with the practiced smile of someone masking tension. Friends, Noti, said her withdrawing, her laughter quieter, her presence dimmer. She was there, but fading, slowly, silently. And then came the hints of infidelity. Stacy had once shown Claire a late-night text she had discovered, the wording vague but intimate. It's nothing, her husband insisted when confronted, but Stacy's instincts screamed otherwise. She feared not only betrayal, but what betrayal might drive him to do if exposed. For Claire, these fragments formed a pattern, one she could no longer ignore. The woman the world believed had drowned in a tragic accident had, in truth, been suffocating long before. Her final whispers about wanting out were not empty fears. They were warnings. The memory weighed on Claire as the days turned to weeks. She replayed their last conversations over and over, guilt tightening around her chest. If only she had pushed harder, insisted louder, maybe Stacy would still be alive. Maybe her secrets would not have gone to the grave with her. But secrets, like bruises, have a way of surfacing. As whispers of betrayal grew louder in Claire's heart, the narrative of the perfect marriage cracked wider. And soon, new evidence would emerge to make those whispers impossible to ignore. The presence of another woman. For weeks after Stacy's funeral, whispers of betrayal haunted her closest friends. The stories of her husband's temper, the chilling words, he'd never let me go, all of it pointed to something darker than an accident. But suspicion needed proof, and soon proof would arrive in the form of another woman. Investigators, urged quietly by those who doubted, began combing through phone records. At first glance, his digital footprint seemed ordinary. Work emails, family group texts, routine calls. But buried deeper, in the late-night hours when Stacy often sat alone downstairs, patterns emerged. Repeated calls to one number. Long, whispered conversations that stretched past midnight. Messages that were carefully deleted but partially recoverable. The name attached to the number was unfamiliar to Stacy's family. But to her husband, it was anything but. She was a woman he had met months earlier, someone from a nearby community group. What began as friendly exchanges had quickly grown intimate. Through the recovered fragments, investigators pieced together a story Stacy had long feared, but never fully confronted. The texts carried words of longing, coded language, promises of a future together, one that did not include Stacy. The mistress became the confidant, the late-night escape, the one who heard his complaints about his wife's nagging, about feeling trapped. Neighbors later admitted seeing him step outside during gatherings, phone pressed to his ear, voice lowered. "I thought it was business," one said. "Now I wonder if I should have looked closer." For Stacy, the betrayal had been felt, if not fully proven. Claire remembered her showing that vague but intimate text. "She knew," Claire said. "She just didn't know how deep it went." The deeper investigators dug, the more damning the picture became. Records revealed calls placed on nights when Stacy told friends she felt ignored, abandoned, or uneasy. The timing was chilling. Moments when she reached for her husband, he was reaching for someone else. But beyond betrayal, the affair revealed something more dangerous: motive. If Stacy truly was considering leaving, if she had hinted at wanting out, her knowledge of his affair could destroy his carefully curated image. Divorce would mean scandal, loss of control, financial unraveling. For a man obsessed with appearances, the stakes could not have been higher. The mistress herself would later testify that he had spoken of being unhappy, of feeling stuck. She claimed he never confessed violence, never threatened his wife directly. Yet her presence in his life, her role as secret partner, turned every suspicion sharper. It was no longer just about a troubled marriage. It was about a man with something to lose, and someone else waiting in the shadows. Cinematic reconstruction would later dramatize these moments. Stacy sitting alone at the kitchen table, phone in hand, staring at a screen that confirmed her deepest fears. Her husband stepping outside under the porch light, whispering into the night, spinning promises to another woman while his wife's silence thickened inside the house. To those who loved Stacy, the revelation cut deep. She had been right. She had sensed it. And in those final months, her whispers of betrayal were not paranoia, but prophecy. The discovery of the affair shifted the case. An accidental death now looked less like tragedy and more like orchestration. A mistress gave reason, motive, and urgency. And as investigators prepared to re-examine the details of Stacy's death, the cracks in her husband's story widened into gaping fractures. The next step would be confronting those inconsistencies and exposing how his version of events could no longer hold. The revelation of the affair cast an entirely new light on the night Stacy died. What once looked like a tragic accident now appeared layered with deceit. Detectives, quietly reopening their files, began comparing every word her husband had spoken against the evidence now unfolding. And soon, contradictions began to surface like fractures in a polished surface. His 911 call was the first place they returned to. On that tape, his voice rang out frantic, almost theatrical. "My wife collapsed in the shower," he cried. He described finding her unresponsive, claimed he pulled her out, tried to revive her. The urgency in his voice sounded real enough at first, but as investigators replayed it, analyzing tone and detail, inconsistencies crept through. His timeline shifted within minutes. One moment he claimed she had only been in the shower for a few minutes, the next he suggested much longer. His description of performing CPR lacked the detail a panicked but genuine attempt would include. When detectives compared his words from the 911 call to his later police interview, the cracks widened. In the call, he said he was right there when Stacy collapsed. But in his interview, he admitted he had stepped away to another room and only returned after hearing a thud. Which was it? Present at the moment she collapsed, or conveniently absent until afterward? Then came the neighbors' accounts. On that evening, several remembered hearing raised voices, muffled but sharp, drifting through the still suburban air. One recalled a woman's voice, angry, desperate, followed by silence. Another described a man's tone, firm and cutting. The timeline of those shouts overlapped with the window of Stacy's supposed accident. If she had slipped and fallen, why had there been shouting first? The contradictions grew heavier under scrutiny. He told officers he was calm when paramedics arrived. Yet wow, witnesses remembered him pacing outside, avoiding eye contact, arms folded rather than reaching out for support. He claimed he had been devastated, unable to think clearly. But in those very first hours, he also managed to call his attorney, a detail that raised eyebrows among investigators who knew grief rarely organizes itself so efficiently. Forensic examiners added to the unease. The bathroom showed little sign of a violent fall. No cracked tiles, no sharp edges where a body might have struck. Yet Stacy's injuries told a more complicated story. Bruises inconsistent with a simple slip. The husband explained them away as the result of pulling her from the tub, but even that detail wavered. In one telling, he said he dragged her out onto the mat. In another, he claimed to have cradled her gently, lowering her onto the floor. The shifting storylines could not coexist. The more investigators replayed his words, the more they noticed his habit of redirecting. Asked a direct question, he would answer with deflection, looping back to how perfect their life had been, how unexpected her death was. The charm that once convinced friends of his devotion now struck detectives as rehearsed. Narration would later highlight these moments with chilling precision, his voice breaking on the tape, his shifting eyes in interviews, the neighbor's memory of hearing Stacy's voice cut off in mid-sentence. A portrait of grief was beginning to crumble into a portrait of control. By now, those who had once defended him, neighbors, friends, even distant relatives, began to hesitate. What had seemed like an unlucky tragedy no longer fit. The affair revealed motive. The contradictions revealed opportunity. And his very words, meant to paint him as a grieving husband, were now betraying him. The investigators weren't ready to accuse him outright. But one thing had become certain. The story he had spun could not withstand the weight of scrutiny. The cracks were widening, and through them, the truth was beginning to seep. The next step would not come from words alone. It would come from the science of the body itself, bruises, timelines, and the silent testimony of forensic evidence waiting to be heard. The contradictions in her husband's story had cracked the surface. Now investigators needed proof strong enough to withstand the weight of a courtroom. Words alone would not be enough. They turned to the silent witness that never lies, the body and the scene it left behind. Forensic experts returned to the house with sharper eyes, their focus no longer dulled by the assumption of accident. The bathroom where Stacy had supposedly slipped looked different now, more staged than tragic. Under the sterile glow of investigative lighting, every detail took on new meaning. The tiles were smooth and unbroken. The tub, large and spotless, showed no scratches or scuffs where a panicked struggle might have left marks. Even the bath mat lay flat, unnaturally neat. To seasoned examiners, it felt less like a scene of sudden collapse and more like a set carefully arranged. The autopsy report, long filed away, was pulled back into the light. Stacy's body carried bruises, small, round marks across her upper arms, darker impressions near her wrists. They did not match the pattern of a fall. Instead, they resembled the grip of hands. The pathologist had noted them at the time, but with no clear evidence of foul play and a grieving husband insisting she simply collapsed, the details had been quietly buried in paperwork. Now, under renewed scrutiny, those bruises told a different story. They spoke of restraint, of force applied in desperation. Her legs bore faint marks, too, angled in ways that suggested pressure from above rather than the randomness of a slip. Then came the lungs. Initial reports had mentioned fluid consistent with drowning, but not in the volume expected. Forensic reanalysis raised chilling questions. If Stacy had collapsed while bathing, her lungs should have been filled with water. Instead, the distribution was uneven, almost as if water had been introduced after death. A drowning staged. Detectives leaned closer to the timeline. Neighbors' accounts of shouting aligned eerily with bruising patterns, an argument escalating into violence. The silence that followed matched the likely window of death. If she had truly fallen, the evidence should have shown chaos, disarray, signs of emergency. Instead, everything was too neat, too ordered, as though time had been taken to reset the room. The husband's narrative began to collapse further. He had described pulling her from the shower, water spilling everywhere. Yet when investigators photographed the bathroom again, they noted the floor was almost bone dry, no sign of soaked towels, no water-streaked tiles, only a faint dampness clinging unnaturally close to the tub. It was as though someone had poured water deliberately, not in the frantic chaos of a rescue, but with measured hands staging a scene. The team brought in a forensic reconstruction specialist. Using mannequins, water testing, and trajectory analysis, they simulated what a collapse in the shower would look like. The results were clear. Stacy's injuries did not align with a simple fall. The angles of bruising, the marks on her arms, the subtle abrasions near her collarbone, they pointed instead to sustained force, a struggle pressed against water until breath gave out. And there was one more haunting detail. In her hair, forensic analysis found traces of diluted soap not fully rinsed away. If she had collapsed mid-shower, water would have continued to run, washing it out over time. But the residue remained, suggesting the water had been turned off quickly, or never truly ran long enough in the first place. Piece by piece, the official narrative unraveled. What had been ruled an accident now stood excellency, posed as an illusion crafted with chilling precision. Forensic narration stitched the findings together. Bruises that reveal a struggle. Water patterns that defy accident. A body that speaks louder than words. In documentaries later, this chapter of the case would be shown in dim-lit reenactments, hands gripping, a shadow pressing down, water running in staged trickles. The image was unmistakable. Stacy had not simply slipped. She had been silenced. Investigators knew the time for doubt was closing. They had motive from the affair, contradictions in testimony, and now forensic evidence pulling the curtain back on a staged drowning. But evidence was not enough on paper. It had to be tied together, carried by voices who could humanize the cold science in front of a jury. And those voices were already stirring, ready to speak. The weight of the evidence pressed harder with each passing day. What began as suspicion had grown into a chain of proof: affair, bruises, water evidence, staged death. Now detectives turned their attention to the one person who had avoided real emotion since the night of Stacy's death: her husband. When confronted in the sterile interview room, his body language told its own story. He sat too still, arms crossed tight against his chest. His eyes darted when questions lingered too long, but his voice carried a strange calmness, as though he believed he could outlast the storm. Detective Alvarez leaned forward, voice steady. "We've gone over your 911 call again. You said you found her in the tub, water everywhere, but the bathroom floor was dry. Can you explain that?" The husband's jaw tightened. "I must have cleaned it up without realizing. Shock does strange things to memory." It was an answer, but not a convincing one. The room grew heavier, the silence after his words louder than the statement itself. Detectives exchanged glances, careful not to push too quickly. Narration carried the moment. When guilt hides, it rarely hides in words. It reveals itself in pauses, in the cracks between excuses, in the silence that fills an interview room. They shifted tactics. Photographs of the bruises were slid across the table, images of her arms, her wrists, her legs. The husband barely looked down. "She bruised easily," he muttered. "She fell sometimes. You're twisting this into something it's not." His tone was cold, detached, not the voice of a grieving widower defending the woman he claimed to love, but that of a man annoyed by interference. Detective Alvarez pressed again. "She told friends she wanted out, that she was afraid of you. Did you know she was planning to leave? For the first time, his eyes flickered. An involuntary reaction, gone in an instant but caught by everyone in the room. He forced a laugh, sharp and unconvincing. People talk when they're unhappy. She wasn't going anywhere. But the slip was there. The certainty with which he said wasn't suggested knowledge deeper than he admitted. The silence thickened. Cameras caught every twitch, every shallow breath. He shifted in his chair, crossing his arms again, his voice losing its earlier confidence. Narration deepened the unease. He spoke in denials, but each word revealed more than it concealed. Where grief should have been, there was control. Where love should have lingered, there was only dismissal. The detectives didn't need a shouted confession. They needed the small betrayals of language, the unguarded cracks that let truth seep through. And slowly, they were piling up. When asked about the affair, he turned colder still. That has nothing to do with this. My personal life doesn't make me a killer. But his knuckles whitened as he gripped the edge of the table. His denial was absolute, yet his body betrayed the pressure pressing in around him. The session ended without an outright confession, but the silence he left behind spoke louder than words. He walked out of the room as if rehearsed, head high, eyes fixed, straight ahead. Yet even in that walk, there was a hollow defiance, an emptiness that revealed he knew the walls were closing in. Back at the station, detectives reviewed the footage frame by frame. Every pause, every glance away, every defensive gesture added to the mosaic of guilt. They didn't have his admission, but they had something almost as powerful, a portrait of denial so cold and unnatural that a jury would feel it in their bones. The narration closed with the haunting weight of the moment. Confessions don't always come in words. Sometimes they arrive in silence, in the spaces where truth should live but doesn't. And in Stacy Feldman's case, silence was deafening. The investigation now moved from the interview room to the courtroom, where silence would no longer protect him. The courthouse stood heavy with silence, a monument to justice wrapped in cold marble and polished wood. For years, Stacy Feldman's death had lived in whispers, in rumors, in suspicion. Now, it was no longer hidden. It was here, laid bare before a jury tasked with deciding whether her husband's silence was that of grief or guilt. Narration framed the moment. Trials are not just about evidence. They are about stories. Two competing versions of truth, told with precision, each fighting to be the one believed. The prosecution wasted no time. In opening statements, District Attorney Klein painted a vivid portrait. This was not an accident. This was not a tragic fall. This was a staged drowning carried out by a husband who could not stand the idea of losing control. Her words landed with sharp edges. Photographs of Stacy, smiling at charity events, laughing with her children, flashed on the courtroom screen, contrasted with the haunting autopsy images. The juxtaposition was devastating. The defense countered quickly, clinging to their thread of possibility. What happened that night was a tragedy, but it was no crime. Accidents happen, even to the strongest among us. Do not let grief blind you into seeing guilt where there is none. They leaned heavily on reasonable doubt, reminding jurors that no one had witnessed the act itself. Witnesses began to take the stand. Stacy's closest friend, Melissa, recounted their last conversations. Her voice cracked as she repeated Stacy's words. She told me she wanted out, that she was afraid. She said, "If anything happens to me, it won't be an accident." The courtroom hung on every syllable. Jurors scribbled notes, eyes fixed forward. Next came the forensic experts. They walked the jury step by step through the overlooked evidence. Charts, diagrams, and detailed photographs filled the courtroom screen. One expert pointed to the bruises on Stacy's arms. These are not consistent with a slip and fall. They are consistent with forceful restraint. Another expert spoke about the water. Her lungs do not match a typical drowning pattern. This is staged. Someone wanted it to look like an accident. The testimony carried the cold authority of science, each fact stripping away the defense's fragile narrative. Still, the defense pushed back. They questioned the reliability of memory, the subjectivity of bruising, the possibility of coincidence. They emphasized Stacy's health struggles, floating the idea that an undiagnosed condition might have caused collapse. Their client, they reminded the jury, was a husband who had lost his wife, nothing more. But the cracks in that portrait deepened when the mistress took the stand. Hidden texts, late-night calls, and promises whispered in secrecy now filled the courtroom. She spoke softly, shame shadowing her face. He told me he wanted a future with me. That Stacy was in the way. I thought he meant divorce. I never thought... Her words trailed off into silence, but the implication echoed loudly. The defense objected, tried to minimize the relevance, but the jury had already seen the thread connect. Motive. Then came the moment no one could ignore. The prosecution played the raw recording of the 911 call. The husband's voice filled the courtroom, frantic on the surface, yet strangely hollow underneath. My wife, she's not breathing. I pulled her from the tub. Please send help. Played beside photographs of the dry bathroom floor, the contradictions were striking. The jurors leaned in as though hearing the cracks for the first time. Narration cut through the tension. Words that once sounded like grief now rang like performance. The call that once painted him as desperate now revealed the emptiness of control. The husband sat expressionless at the defense table, his face a mask. He rarely glanced at the jury, choosing instead to stare straight ahead. To some, it looked like strength. To others, it looked like ice. Day by day, piece by piece, the puzzle was laid out before 12 strangers tasked with seeing through the fog. Stacy's final hours had been fractured, but now they came together. Her whispers of fear, the mistress's betrayal, the bruises, the water, the silence of her husband. As the final witness stepped down, the prosecution ended with quiet weight. Stacy Feldman's death was not a mystery. It was a choice made by the man who was supposed to love her most. Do not let him hide behind silence. Sigh. The courtroom fell into heavy quiet. The jury would soon deliberate, but already the air carried the sense of gravity, that truth, long buried, was finally speaking. And in that silence, everyone waited for the verdict. The jury room door opened with the sound of finality. 12 strangers had carried the weight of Stacy Feldman's life and death in their hands, and now their decision was ready. The courtroom hushed as they filed back in, eyes heavy, faces unreadable. Every breath seemed louder than usual, every movement amplified by the silence of expectation. Narration framed the tension. Verdicts are not just answers, they are reckonings, moments where truth, lies, grief, and justice converge in a single declaration. The judge called the court to order. St. Acey's parents clutched each other in the front row, knuckles white, hearts pounding. Her closest friends sat just behind them, their faces wet with tears they hadn't tried to hide. At the defense table, her husband sat still, jaw tight, expression carved into stone. For weeks he had maintained control, projecting calm even under mounting evidence. But now, as the jury four-person rose, his eyes flickered, just once, just enough to reveal the dread beneath. The four-person unfolded the paper. The courtroom leaned forward. On the charge of murder in the first degree, we, the jury, find the defendant guilty. Gasps filled the room. Some wept quietly. Others exhaled relief after years of uncertainty. Stacy's mother buried her face into her husband's shoulder, her sobs breaking the silence in waves. For the first time, the husband's mask cracked. His lips trembled, his eyes narrowed, and his carefully rehearsed composure slipped. He shook his head slowly, whispering under his breath, "No. No. This isn't right." The prosecutor's team sat in grim silence, their victory tempered by the weight of loss. There was no celebration, only acknowledgement that justice, however necessary, could never restore what had been taken. The defense attorney placed a hand on his client's shoulder, whispering something inaudible, but the husband jerked away, fists clenching. His face darkened, the facade of control giving way to anger, then to despair. For weeks he had denied, deflected, dismissed. But the verdict stripped him bare. In that moment, the courtroom saw not the grieving widower he had pretended to be, but the man capable of staging his wife's death and living with the secret for years. Narration cut through the emotion. Betrayal has many faces: silence, infidelity, control. But here, in a courtroom heavy with grief, betrayal was unmasked as murder. The judge's voice carried solemn authority. The jury's verdict is accepted. Stacy's loved ones embraced, their tears mingling with relief and sorrow. Her friend Melissa whispered through sobs, "She can finally rest." Yet even in victory, the grief was unbearable. No verdict could bring Stacy back. No sentence could erase the nights her children had spent wondering why their mother never came home. Outside the courthouse, cameras clicked, lights flashed, and reporters shouted for statements. The town, once lulled by the illusion of a perfect marriage, now faced the truth: that behind the facade of charity events and smiling photographs was a darkness that had stolen a life. The husband was led away in handcuffs, no longer able to control the story. For years he had lived free, cloaked in the narrative of accident. But as he disappeared into the shadows of custody, his silence no longer mattered. The world now knew the truth. Narration closed the chapter with haunting weight. Justice had spoken, but it came at a cost. For Stacy's family, the verdict was not triumph, but survival. For her friends, it was not closure, but confirmation of the fears she had once whispered. And for the town, it was a scar that would never fade, a reminder that even the most perfect-looking lives can hide the darkest truths. As the courthouse emptied, one truth remained clear. Stacy Feldman's voice had been silenced, but her story had not. It lived on, in the verdict, in the grief, and in the fragile hope that justice, however delayed, still matters. The morning was quiet. Gray skies stretched thin across the horizon as Stacy Feldman's family made their way to the cemetery. The weight of the verdict still hung heavy in the air, but today was not about the courtroom or justice. It was about Stacy. Her grave was adorned with fresh flowers, tokens of remembrance from friends, neighbors, and strangers who had followed her story. Narration framed the scene with quiet solemnity. Why? Trials end. Verdicts are delivered. But grief never follows the court's schedule. For the ones left behind, justice is not an ending. It is only another beginning. Stacy's mother knelt by the headstone, her trembling hands brushing soil from the engraved letters of her daughter's name. Her voice was soft, almost a whisper. "You should still be here, Stace. Laughing, living, raising your kids." Her father stood behind her, silent, one hand on her shoulder. The years of loss had deepened the lines on his face, but today, for the first time, there was a faint exhale of release. Not relief, never relief, but the knowledge that truth had finally been spoken aloud in a place where lies once lived. Nearby, Melissa, Stacy's closest friend, held a small bouquet. She closed her eyes, remembering the last conversation they had shared. The whispered fears about control, betrayal, and wanting out. Tears streaked her cheeks as she placed the flowers gently on the grass. "You weren't wrong," she murmured. "You knew. And now everyone knows, too." The camera of memory replayed images of Stacy's life. Her smile at charity events, her laughter at dinners with friends, the warmth she carried into every room. These flashes stood in stark contrast to the darkness of her final night. She had been more than her death, more than a victim. She had been a mother, a daughter, a friend, someone whose life deserved to be remembered in full, not defined by betrayal. Her children approached the grave next, small hands clutching each other. Too young to fully grasp the magnitude, yet old enough to feel the absence, they placed handmade notes at the base of the stone. Crayon words spelled out love, confusion, and longing. One card read simply, "I miss you, Mommy." Narration lingered. The cost of truth is often measured not in verdicts, but in the lives left fractured. For Stacy's children, justice came. Too late to bring back bedtime stories or morning hugs. For her friends and family, justice came at the cemetery was silent but for the rustle of leaves in the wind. Yet in that stillness there was something powerful, an unspoken acknowledgement that the truth, buried for years, had finally surfaced. Lies can be staged, evidence can be manipulated, but truth is patient. It waits in the shadows, biding its time until it cannot be ignored. As the family gathered for a final moment of silence, Melissa's voice broke softly through the air. "They tried to bury the truth with you, Stacy, but the truth always rises." The camera pulled back, imagery lingering on the headstone surrounded by flowers, notes, and candles flickering in the wind. Narration closed the story. The staged death of Stacy Feldman was meant to look like an accident, a tragedy to be mourned and forgotten. But it became something else entirely, a testament to the persistence of truth, to the strength of family, and to the hidden fractures that betrayals leave behind. Justice was delivered, but grief remains eternal. And in the echoes of Stacy's story we are reminded, secrets may bury love, lies may stage death, but the truth will never stay silent. As dusk settled over the cemetery, the family began to leave, one by one. The last to turn away was her daughter, who looked back at the headstone, lips moving in a silent goodbye. The shot lingered, the world fading around her,